In Europe, the premium car market has been dominated for a very long time by the Germans. Here in Britain, it seems that people almost exclusively want a BMW, Audi or Mercedes if they're looking to spend any kind of money. Companies like Lexus have tried hard and failed to get themselves a little piece of that market segment, and even our own Jaguar really struggle, to the extent that they decided to cancel the long-awaited replacement for the XJ, presumably because they thought nobody was going to buy it. The DS sub-brand was created in 2012, but didn't officially arrive in Europe until 2015. It took a few years to find its feet, but now it knows what it wants to be. And although it was split off from Citroën, the company wants to go in a very, very different direction. And that's up. They have their sights set purely on the Germans and their equivalents. They're keen to point out the fact that they are already selling more cars than Lexus in 18 key markets around the world. That's not bad for a company that hasn't been around for all that long. In many ways, DS are really doing things the right way, because they believe that a premium experience is about more than just the car. For that reason, where many other brands are going online only, they're still investing in bricks and mortar dealerships, because they know that being able to speak to people face to face, touch, feel and smell the car is all part of what makes the buying experience so special. And then if you do buy one of their cars, they'll make sure that each year you're invited to different events and experiences on them just for being part of the DS family. And that's the kind of stuff you'd expect more from a brand like Bentley than BMW. The range is presently fairly small, and this week I've been living with the DS7 Crossback, one of their big sellers and a car from the ultra-competitive and very popular small SUV segment. I've been attending a wedding this week, and so I've done over 1,000 miles in all sorts of conditions and terrain and can now deliver a fairly definitive verdict. This is a fabulous car, but it's not an unqualified success, and some very odd decisions have been made throughout the design process. The first is in your choice of engines. This is the range-topping E-Tense 4x4. This is not a particularly large car, being smaller than the Jaguar F-Pace, the Audi Q5 or the BMW X3. But because DS is a premium brand, you'd expect it to have a reasonable range of engines on offer. Unfortunately, this 1.6-litre four-cylinder turbo hybrid is the most potent you will currently find in the range, with the base being a 1.2. This car makes 300 horsepower, 200 from the combustion engine up front, driving only the front wheels, and another 220 from a pair of electric motors at the rear. Yes, if you combine those two figures, you'll get more than 400 horsepower, but that's just not how these things work. Now that's many things, but to me, 1.6 litres just doesn't scream premium. For the £56,000 of this particular press car, Audi will sell you a 350 horsepower 3-litre V6 turbo diesel SQ5. And they've been taking other lessons from the Germans, because there are a lot of things on this car that are still optional, despite the fact it's the almost top-level Opera trim. Confusingly, there is a level above this called Louvre, but you cannot have it with a hybrid. So these are some of the optional things on this car. The paint. No, seriously, if you want anything other than plain white, this is pearlescent, that's extra. The night vision system that they bang on about in all of their literature, that's extra. Self-parking, that's extra. Auto-dimming mirrors, that's extra. Panoramic roof, extra. But there are some things you do get as standard. So you get very nice LED lights which dance when you open the car. Seriously. You also get double glazing. You have Apple CarPlay, Android Auto, and up front, heated, ventilated and massage leather seats, which are really very nice. The standard stereo is also excellent, and for another £1,000 you can upgrade to a Focal Electra system, which I've heard in one of their other cars and is excellent, beating out many other systems that cost quite a bit more. In fact, the bass stereo in this is actually pretty decent, better than the upgraded stereo in the Polestar that I had the other week. The interior is also a really genuinely very nice place to spend your time. There is a little bit of scratchy plastic here and there, but not much of it, and not where you're generally going to find it. The surfaces you do interact with are largely leather covered. The quality of it is really quite nice. The stitching is exceptional. There's lots of interesting shapes and patterns in here, and the whole brand is really trying to be inspired by the haute couture fashion that Paris in particular is really famous for. They're very proud of their trick stitching in the doors, and I like the fact that I haven't seen seen any switches in here really that I recognise from other cars. That may be because I haven't spent a lot of time in Citroens of late, but still it does feel like a real bespoke product. This is a very, very comfortable thing. I did 500 miles in one day and arrived feeling somewhat refreshed. It's not perfect though, and you've got a nice big screen up here combined with another here. This one I rather like because it's matte, which means even when the sun is shining on it, you can still read it nicely. But there's no heads-up display, and the screen here has a row of buttons below it which are all touch sensitive. They are rather unintuitive, and when you're driving it's somewhat distracting to have to look at them and work out what it is you want to do. Also, this car does have Android Auto and Apple CarPlay, but not wireless, and unlike some current Volkswagens, it doesn't talk to the rest of the car. So if you want to use Google Maps for your navigation, like everybody does, you've got to do it exclusively from this screen here. It will not send directions to the car. A heads-up display is not even an option in this car. The DS4, I think, is one of the first to actually get that, and it works very well in there, and really, this should have had it. Likewise, a panoramic sunroof should really be standard because it would go a long way to lifting this cabin. You don't have to have black, but there is only one other option for the interior. The rear seats recline, which is again another feature you wouldn't expect to find in a car at this price point, and overall, I do quite like it. One reason you might not want a sunroof is that it will compromise slightly your headroom in the back. At present though, it's excellent and you can put fairly tall passengers in all four seats, no problem whatsoever. Boot space is also decent at 555 litres, and most importantly, you don't lose anything by having the hybrid, unlike the Toyota Corolla, which was severely compromised. This is pretty good for a weekend away, but again, won't be able to compete with cars in the class above. If you're expecting this to be cavernous, you may be disappointed. The original Citroen DS was famed for its otherworldly ride, thanks to its very clever yet elegant hydraulic self-leveling suspension. Here you have a much more conventional setup with regular springs and dampers, but higher trim level cars such as this get what they call active scan. At the front you have a camera that can read the road ahead and feed that information back to the car, so each corner can be prepared for what is about to come. The idea being that you'll get still a level of ride comfort, but without the compromises of the older all-mechanical system. So, how then does the DS7 fare out in the real world? The truth is, there are now very few truly bad cars. It's been an awfully long time since I've driven something that was actually so bad I can't imagine anyone buying one. Instead, what you get are cars that simply miss the mark, or perhaps not so good value for money. To work out whether they've been a success or not, you have to simply ask, what is it trying to be, and has it achieved that? In the case of the DS7 and the DS brand overall, the mission is very, very clear. They want to be a premium marque. And when I've spoken to the people that work for the company, they've told me that from now on, prices are only going to go up. But if they want to be able to justify ever-increasing RRPs, they're going to need to deliver products that people really want to buy and feel worthwhile. First impressions in the DS7 are really rather good. The seats are fantastic. Not only do they look good, they're also very comfortable and surprisingly supportive too. They've actually got quite a bit of bolstering on the sides. The steering wheel is nice in the handle. The switchgear, like I've said, is really rather nice. The display is quite clear, although if you want the rev counter, you do have to go looking for it. The only way I've found you can actually get it is by putting this into your individual mode, and even then you have to customize it so that that is one of the displays. The car clearly has not been designed for the dedicated petrol head, and I have to look at it as such, but it does have an awful lot of charm. On long motorway journeys, it is really quite well suited. On a well-paved road like this, the comfort mode really is what it says. The ride quality is actually quite good, although it's much like a lot of air suspension systems that I've driven in that its primary ride is very good. The secondary is a mixed bag. Smaller imperfections in the road, those sharper speed restrictions that you encounter every now and again, do make the chassis judder just a little bit more than you think it should. And when the battery has charged, the car also doesn't feel underpowered at all. In fact, it has quite a bit to go in it. And when you really do push on, it doesn't even sound that bad either. It feels like a pretty big car, visibility isn't the best, and you do get the sensation you are taking up all the road. There are other elements too where the car does well that I didn't expect it to. So steering feel is actually pretty good. It doesn't move around in your hand like a classic 911, but then I didn't expect that of it. But what it does have is a very reassuring weighting, even in its comfort settings. Speaking of driving modes, there are quite a few to choose from. You have electric, which does exactly what you might expect. You've then got comfort, which is what I've been using most of the time, hybrid, sport, and four-wheel drive. Four-wheel drive will force the car to be running all wheels at the same time, using both petrol and electric power. The two powertrains will only drive one end of the car, so you need both for all-wheel drive. Really, it's comfort mode that I've been using most of the time. Road noise is not too bad. The double glazing certainly helps in that regard, and generally speaking, it's a pretty good car to go about your daily business. Although this doesn't have the park assist system, I'm not sure I actually trust those anyway, but what you do have is a 360-degree camera with some very nice functions like an automatic zoom that make parking and moving around in tight spaces really quite easy. The lack of the panoramic roof is something of a disappointment, and it makes this interior feel just a little bit more oppressive than it really should. A luxury to me is not just about quality of materials and technology, it's also about lightness and a feeling of space, and that you don't quite get in here. There are even little shift paddles behind the wheel, and they look really rather nice. Unfortunately, they're horrible to use, but that's okay because, I'll be honest, if this car has a weakness, it's the fact that sport mode is almost entirely pointless. I will now demonstrate by putting the car in sport mode. There is no real way of putting it in manual. You've got a B mode, which simply gives you more regeneration for the hybrid system, but if you've got manual gear shift, you can kind of pull a paddle and then the car will move and it will go around a bend, sort of, but this is not what it wants to be doing. Brakes are a weak point. The brake pedal does not communicate with you at all, and if you look at them you can tell these brakes don't seem particularly appropriate for a car pushing 2 tons when you're driving sporty. In normal conditions they're absolutely up to the task, but if you were going to press on, I think you'd find their limit fairly quickly. However, that being said, the car does really surprise you with its turn of pace. That's only when it's got electric power in it. Unfortunately, that's not a lot of the time. When fully charged, this car will have in it something like about 30 miles worth of range. But by default, when you start this car, it will be in full electric mode. And the car does that because it's trying to impress you with its fuel economy and CO2 figures. And while there is battery power, those are actually quite impressive. When I came up to Scotland, the first sort of 50 miles of the journey, this car averaged about 70 miles to the gallon. Okay, that's quite some way short of the near 200 miles per gallon that you'll see claimed in various places, but it would appear the new driving cycle tests that we have are just as useless as the old ones for giving you real-world fuel economy figures. Even still, 70 mpg in a big car is very, very good, and it maintains that up until the point the battery runs out, after which things aren't so good. I have now achieved over the last 625 miles an average of 36.1 mpg. All of a sudden this car's hybrid credentials really do seem to be rather questionable, because that's about the same sort of fuel economy I averaged in the considerably larger and more powerful Audi SQ7 TDI with its 4-litre twin-turbo V8. Turning circle is excellent, and in urban scenarios that's going to be another plus point for the DS7. But for me, there is something of a philosophical debate at the heart of this car. £55,000 sounds like a lot of money, largely because it is. However, in the car world, it doesn't go anywhere near as far as it used to. My friend recently bought himself a Jaguar XJ6. That's the top Jaguar model, albeit the entry version of. And that, about 18 years ago, was 40 grand. Now, 40 grand would only just about get you into a Golf GTI. So 55k for a luxury car isn't actually that much anymore. But what this car's also trying to do at the same time is be economical, environmentally friendly in terms of CO2 and fuel. And that really is a bit of a problem because they're two quite opposing things. And I don't think with this car, they've quite got the balance right. You see, any large car really does need a big engine if it wants to feel effortless. And the issue with this is because it's so keen to use that electric power for fuel economy, when you come to ask for it for performance, very often you'll find it's just not there. And because the battery is so small, 30 miles of range is not really that much. If you want to keep it topped up, you're going to be charging this thing all the bleeding time. And that becomes quite laborious, quite fast. That's not enjoyable. That's not, to my mind, luxurious. There are people out there I know who will say, yes, but that's perfect because we only ever do short journeys. And if you're driving this in pure electric mode, it's actually quite good. In fact, the electric motors have more torque between them than the petrol one. So you can do a lot with them. But if you are going to drive the car in such a way as you're only ever using electric power, why don't you just go and buy an electric car? Surely that would make more sense. And then you'd get a lot more electric range and therefore less range anxiety. Speaking of which, some bright spark, presumably for packaging reasons, has shrunk the fuel tank for the hybrid version. It's only 43 litres, and that means even when absolutely brimmed, this car on the motorway only seems to want to go about 300 miles. That is really not good. When you're then driving around the city, it's of course going to be even worse, unless you're using constantly that electric assistance. This, to me, just doesn't seem the right way to do things. I think they should have taken a different path with this. I think they should have done things a little bit more like the Toyota Corolla, but with a more luxury/performance twist, not a plug-in. And they should have said, look, this is the luxury car, and we're going to set it up so that it manages its battery all the time. It'll always have some power in it, and there'll always be power in reserve, so that if you do need to drive the thing on pure electric, you can do that. One thing I will say for the DS7 is that there is a menu where you can set it and say, you know what, always keep either 6, 12 miles of range or a full battery. Unfortunately, the car will forget these settings every time you get into it. So you can't say, yeah, that's how the car can be run. It'll forget every time, and that's annoying. And when it's so desperate to chew through the battery, it's just irksome. We are now currently driving on pure electric power, and you barely even notice the changeover. I know why they didn't want to show you the rev counter, because honestly, the car's actually pretty good at doing a seamless changeover. And I think if this were run as a mild hybrid, it would be absolutely sensational to drive. But as a plug-in, it just doesn't work. It needs a lot more battery power for my money to really be successful, or just to go, look, we're going to manage the battery ourselves and use it as a performance aid, because that is the luxury thing. This is still trying to be an economical little French car. And if the DS brand really wants to break out of that mold, they need to do things just a little bit differently than how they are currently. Overall though, niggles aside, like the lack of a panoramic sunroof, it's actually been a pretty dependable car, and I have enjoyed my time with it. I also recently drove the new DS4, and I think that's a car that maybe worked just a little bit better in many areas than this, and I look forward to seeing how the brand evolves over the next few years. I don't see this as being a big seller. I predict most people are still going to go with the obvious and established German alternatives, and to be honest, at the present time, they do seem to offer quite a bit more value for money. When I think of that BMW M340i that I drove, yeah, sure, inside maybe it doesn't feel quite as haute couture as this, but a lot of buyers, I think, probably don't worry. They like the German badge, they like the fact that it is really rather fast, and most painfully, when you are on a run, it's probably not actually that much worse on fuel either. So the DS7 Crossback, for my money, is certainly a very fine attempt, and if you can get one at the right price, it's definitely a car many will consider, but I think still a car that few will actually commit to. Thanks for watching. Please like, comment down below, subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you for the next one. Bye bye.